Hello.
Hello. How are you?
I'm fine. The others don't see you yet.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe I just start speaking already. Yeah. Hello. I'm Anja Dorn. We are just meeting in this moment for the first time. I'm doing the moderation. I'm teaching curatorial studies here. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Angela Harutyunyan. I rehearsed it, but I don't manage. Harutyunyan, is that it? Yeah.
Yes.
Who is an art historian and a curator, and she is an associate professor of art history and theory and the head of the art history program at the American University of Beirut, which we will hear a bit about now in your talk also. And she, in her research work, she did not only deal with theories of art history, but also a lot with late Soviet and post-Soviet art, where she also did numerous exhibitions collaborating with curators and artists there. And a major concern within that are public spheres after socialism and how they develop. And of course also art and labor and cultural politics in the Middle East. She is editor of the Art Margins magazine, which I found really interesting because it's also one of the magazines that deals that is like a space where people from marginal places dealing with art are meeting and exchanging in the idea of potential space. Her book titled The Political Aesthetics of the Armenian Avant-Garde, The Journey of the Painter Real, is published in Manchester University. And I think you also come from Armenia, is that right?
Yes, I grew up there until I left Armenia about 12 years ago.
So we are very much looking forward to hear your talk. As we knew that the situation with the Skype talk is a bit complicated, we also gave out the manuscripts of the talk. So if you want to, you can also follow the lecture by reading. Here you go.
Thank you very much.
Wait a second. I quickly show you your audience because I know you didn't start.
That would help.
There they are.
Okay, wonderful. Hello. I apologize for not being able to be there in person and follow discussions that have been developing in the last 2 days. The circumstances didn't allow me. So I apologize if my intervention could maybe sound somewhat out of place because I haven't been following other contributions to the conference. My intervention today is also somewhat polemical. It will slightly deviate from the very admirable proposition of the conference organizers to think of future models for art and design education as potential spaces. And please let me know if my voice doesn't come through or if I'm too fast. I will try to accommodate difference between the existing world and the virtual world. So instead, today I would rather, I'm finding myself driven by the imperative to historicize not only the place of arts and humanities in the neoliberal university, but also the structure of the university itself. This need for historicization is driven by a realization, perhaps an anxious one, since we all kind of live in anxious times, that a certain era has ended and the shapes and contours of the new one are not entirely clear. However, tendencies can be discerned if we consider some of the symptomatic developments in the academia as it pertains especially to arts and humanities. So any proposition for potential spaces, first and foremost, needs to come to terms with and map the existing spaces in terms of their structure, form, content, and ideology. So my brief intervention As I already mentioned, will turn out to be rather polemical. The university where I work, the American University in Beirut, applauds its newly formed capital campaign of raising the so-called profile of arts and humanities via packaging humanistic disciplines as new shiny products for business majors and engineers, and encouraging the understanding of arts as comforting commodities and spectacle for the new bourgeoisie. This campaign is symptomatically called boldly AUB, the campaign to lead, innovate, and serve. And the language is already driven by corporate PR developments. In this climate, my colleagues and I are increasingly face the demand to organize popular events driven by visibility, raise student enrollment numbers in our courses while struggling to justify the somewhat unpopular decisions that we make regarding our curricula and the autonomy of this curricula from the market-driven logic. To trace the increasing penetration of the market logic into the academia, one needs to look at the historical moments of post-1989. And I think the post-Soviet condition and the so-called post-colonial condition in the Middle East have a lot to share. With neoliberal capitalism's expansion on a global scale, and with the triumph of liberalism, models of North American education were exponentially exported to territories hitherto under different educational regimes and pedagogic practices. This new wave of expansion coincides with the proliferation of post-colonial and culturalist discourses that, quote-unquote, give voice to the other, are concerned with the politics of representation. And what is interesting is that the post-colonial discourses developed within the Anglo-American academia have been internalized by local academics in the Middle East, such as in Beirut, in Cairo, and other academic institutions. However, the seemingly contradictory discursive demand for the other to speak for itself and the structural subsumption of education in the logic of market relations are the side of the same coin. So vis-a-vis these discourses and processes, I will call for a critical pedagogy embedded in a universal conception of class struggle, and for cognitive mapping, borrowing from Frederick Jameson, as necessary tools to combat the total subsumption of education in late capitalism. I consider the post-Soviet condition as symptomatic for the neoliberal transformations of academia, as the former Soviet republics witnessed a wholesale structural transformation of their economic, social, and cultural institutions in the 90s. Further, in this talk, I extend the post-Soviet condition of the neoliberalization of education to Beirut as a site where the contradictions of capitalism are made most visible because of the seeming lack of the state with its mediating function between capital and society. So I conceive of the post-Soviet as embedded, on the one hand, in a specific geopolitical and historical experience following the collapse of the Soviet Union, yet it can be also generalized as a global condition. As the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed in 89 and the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, the ideologues of neoliberalism on the other side of the curtain hailed the supposed end of history, by which was meant the end of ideological struggle. If Fukuyama's famous doctrine puts the final ideological nail in the coffin of the Soviet ideology, shock therapy, as a set of economic policies of rapid marketization, intensified the disintegration of the Soviet as a historical experience and as a project of modernization. Fukuyama's end of history, at the same time, announced a new era of global war, this time anchored in cultural difference and identity. This neoconservative doctrine and its core prognostic aspects provided the justification for the culturalization of politics, meaning politics turned to a struggle for identity, recognition, and representation on the one hand, and marketization of culture on the other. Culture produced this commodity. Especially in its first operation, that is, culturalization of politics in the guise of the clash of identities, it met the core program of the discourses of post-colonial culturalism, with its stress on difference and the postmodernist irreconcilability of identities. As the former Soviet Union was discovered as a phantasmic site of cultural difference, the former Soviet subject in turn overperformed opposite identification with the West, understood as a dream world of freedom and consumer choice. The shock therapy implemented programmatically by the Chicago School economists as a set of economic measures that included privatization, deregulation of currency and prices, as well as withdrawal of state subsidies for social services, ensured rapid disintegration of public structures, including education. The former Soviet citizens were finally seen and embraced as emerging out of their infantile immaturity and rediscovering the inevitable truth of their historical being, private property and private interest. In this jungle, the fittest survived, and the redundant Soviet intelligentsia that had memorized dialectical materialism and the story of the historical victory of class struggle in state socialism via schematized textbooks of Marx and Lenin Institute, either reinvented itself in the new garments of post-Soviet entrepreneurship or emigrated to the lands of their fantasy, only to face bare economic survival in America and Europe. Wow, this was a long sentence. As the neoliberal market economy was heralded as the new messiah, the former Soviet intelligentsia and the cultural avant-garde had to wave goodbye not only to the disappearing phantom of the Soviet ideology, but also to the phantasmic image of their America, as constructed in the imagery of the late Soviet citizen. As the Russian band, music band Nautilus Pompilius sings in a 1999 song, I quote, "When all those songs that I don't know are all but faded down in the sharp testing air, you'll hear a scream of my last paper boat, goodbye America, or where I have never ever been, farewell forever." End of quote. As America materialized in the former Soviet space in the form of liberalism's and market economy's triumph, the phantasmic America disappeared with the last paper boat. In 1990s, the shock therapy's economic effects were paired with tectonic shifts within the cultural and educational infrastructure, with the new models of managerialism, marketing, and administration forming the cultural logic of post-Soviet capitalism via Sorosization of society, George Soros's programs, now on the path to becoming civic, and implementation of the American university model. Soros's importation of cultural and educational infrastructure, models, and resources in the name of battling the enemies of open society promised to scrape out the last relics of the Soviet superstructure and engineer new enlightened civic agents that had to be saved from their own pasts. Until then, former Soviet citizens were seen as victims to be subjected to proper treatment by the human rights discourses and their technologies of salvation. In Armenia, as early as 1991, the American University of Armenia was established, symptomatically occupying the former building of the Soviet Republic's Central Committee's Political Enlightenment House. As the public infrastructure was disintegrating from the double blow of the death of the Soviet ideology and the lack of public finance, the American educational model promised new tuition-paying elites skills and aptitudes that would enable them smoothly float on the surface in the conditions of chaotic kleptocracy and war capitalism. The subsumption of the former Soviet territories under the rule of the market and the proliferation of new training programs in management and business administration took place in various former republics with varying intensity and of different effects, as the public educational institutions with clearly defined and ingrained hierarchical organization inherited from Soviet times, and the bureaucratization of the academia was already taking place since the 40s, 50s, we're not going to transform. So you have two overlapping structures. On the one hand, the new models of education, and on the other hand, the very persistent remnants of Soviet bureaucratized education. So the gradual neoliberalization of the academia mixed with the remnants of Stalinist nationalist orthodoxy culminated in the formal acceptance of the Bologna process in early 2005 that implements a credit hour system as well as the bachelor-master division. One could say that the old emperor was now wearing new clothes. If the structure of the academic programs in public universities changed to accommodate the two-tier BA and MA degrees, the actual content of these programs, especially in the humanities and social sciences, presented an eclectic mix of Soviet positivist scholarship, nationalist ideology, and a few glances on postmodernist literature. So I've started my talk in this polemic mode, in a sense, in relation to the post-Soviet condition, even if my main topic here is not the post-Soviet experience as such. And as I mentioned already, I consider the post-Soviet development symptomatic for what I call the third wave of expansion of the US educational infrastructure and its models globally. The first wave, epitomized in the late 19th and early 20th century American university model, was very much carried through with a religious justification mixed with an Enlightenment promise for the cultivation of pre-modern ethnic subjects. For instance, the university where I teach, the American University of Beirut, was established in 1866 as Syrian Protestant college by missionaries, and this is also the case with the American University in Cairo, established in 1919, similarly by American missionaries. The second wave of expansion can be located to the post-World War II context and was executed within the logic of the Cold War's ideological and developmental imperatives. The 90s paradigm, in turn, which I call the third wave, presents an intensification of the structural expansion of the US academia on a global scale, hitherto unprecedented. And of course, we see the symptoms, the proliferation of this model, not just in the Middle East, but also in the Gulf. Various American universities establishing their own branches, such as NYU, Virginia Commonwealth, and so on and so forth, but also in Singapore, in China, in Japan, etc. So the university and higher educational institutions in general can be considered privileged sites from which one can not only observe, but importantly, analyze and critique broader social and historical developments. This is so because the university has traditionally been considered as forming a semi-autonomous sphere from other social and economic institutions, driven by blatant profit and private interest. Knowledge transmitted and research produced was expected, or has been traditionally expected, to be objective, impartial, and not subservient to the pressures driven by partial interest. Of course, this expectation of impartiality is the legacy of the Enlightenment and can be considered as part and parcel of the bourgeoisie's tendency to universalize its own class ideology. But one could argue that this promise of the autonomy of knowledge and truth and of universality cannot simply be subjected to simple ideological critique as mere deceptions and false consciousness that serve the interests of a particular class. Within the bourgeois society itself, the university exceeded its own ideological conditions and class interests, and at times and at different historical moments, such as in 1917 and 1960s, but also other moments can be established, became a site of social antagonism and struggle. So what I call the third wave of expansion of the US educational model and university structures on the wings of neoliberalization has signaled the transformation of the university from being a site of social antagonism and rigorous debate to a degree-granting machine that supplies the existing structures with new labor power and aims at consumer satisfaction. Both students viewed as consumers, but also the potential job suppliers. These developments are often more intense and visible in American universities abroad, I would argue, than in US campuses, since the former American universities abroad are often semi-independent structures not entirely subject to local legislations and labor laws. Here are a few characteristics of American universities outside of the US that both signal the ongoing transformations within the US educational structure in the United States, but also present these processes in an intensified and crystallized form. This includes a governing structure that is administratively heavy and top-down, the expansion basically of the administration, introduction of high tuition fees to different contexts that had histories of public education and structures of public education, implementation of tools and technologies for assessment drawn from the business world, such as program learning outcomes that are ultimately about quantifying knowledge, periodic program and faculty reviews assessed by impact factors, standardization of the language of assessment across disciplines, prioritization of so-called money-making vocational trainings at the expense of arts and humanities, and the incorporation of humanistic disciplines as pragmatic self-help tools in various vocational training programs. For instance, ethics courses tailored for engineers, art history classes made for business entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth. So this does not mean that the basic tenets of the modern university as the site of impartial critique and truth is being erased, but that the neoliberal logic of marketization takes up the vocabulary inherited from the Enlightenment and performs an operation of newspeak, if we recall Orwell. For instance, critique is replaced with criticality. We hear in these PLOs that students have to gain tools of criticality, which implies a subjective critical attitude that does not even need an object of critique. Rigorous argumentation is turned to the tyranny of opinion, and student and faculty empowerment is understood as clicking the boxes of multicultural and gender diversity.
Angela, could you fix your camera a bit? Because what is actually, sorry for interrupting you, but it looks so funny.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks. That was all.
The text and yeah. Now okay, thanks. Then, is this fine now?
Yeah, great.
Okay, more straight. Okay. So then how to combat alienation induced by the hyper-bureaucratization of the academia when a minor change requires multiple committee approvals and slow time for implementation, whereas board of trustees and administrations can parachute buildings, units, and programs overnight. So basically for us to even make minute curriculum changes, it requires multiple committee meetings, multiple approval processes, but then we can be put into structures, into organizational divisions, into buildings that have been parachuted, decided upon by the administration. I propose that any transformation, given the means that the faculty possesses, should first and foremost take place at the level of teaching and curriculum. As a core pedagogic practice, I subscribe to critical pedagogy that takes up critique as its starting point and immediately engages with the object of critique. In this, class analysis and class struggle are understood as preconditions for a critical pedagogy that combats criticality as a subjective and relational attitude. And as a signifier for opinion and multicultural diversity. This approach is both content-driven and structural. In terms of content, critical pedagogy aims to make students aware of the labor-capital relations within late capitalism, and structurally it aims to position them within these relations. This is essentially an urgent undertaking in Lebanon in the context of what I call the new Gilded Age in country of the post-war, in post-war conditions, marked by the alliance of the nouveau bourgeoisie and the old money classes, that in turn operate via political consensus between various sects to ensure reproduction of all the new capital, all the new money. Peter McLaren, in his call for critical pedagogy, defines the political nature of pedagogic practice in the following way, quote, an encounter with the processes of knowledge production from within the dynamics of a concrete historical movement that transcends individuality, dogmatism, and certainty. In order to combat the tendencies towards the non-conceptual, in which thinking is constructed as a performance of ethics, or as a post-truth pragmatics, or as an open-ended, non-determinate process that resists totalizing topological systems. End of quote. The art history curriculum that we developed with my colleagues provides a materialist understanding of art history within the mode of production. Rather than valorizing art history as simply a product of economic conditions or a disciplinary tool for colonization and Western cultural domination upon its others, we explore the constitution of the discipline in terms of its relative or heterogeneous autonomy in relation to social structures, yet as embedded in them. Constructed around key philosophical and theoretical texts, the curriculum emphasizes close reading of this text in order to create a dialectical and complex understanding of the development of concepts and their historical transformation by artistic and art institutional practices. We do not advocate interdisciplinarity as a disciplining tool for a new de-differentiation of fields and their collapse into each other. Instead, we believe that any convergence between the disciplines any convergences are attempts to push the boundaries of the disciplines themselves according to the specific spheres of competencies they provide. Taking up the mode of production as an object of a holistic understanding of economy, society, and culture, nevertheless, we take a biased and partial analysis of this mode of production through an art historical lens. So in a way, capitalism appears through art historical, art theoretical perspective informed by critical theory, by sociology, by economic analysis, and so on. So this approach takes up reality as a determining factor for theorizing, rather than simply prescribing canonical texts that can be applied to the current conditions. Canonical texts of art history, aesthetic, and critical theory, as well as art theory, are assigned, but not as prescriptive programs. Instead, they help students to de-reify familiar and habitual ways of understanding their own present and its historical constitution. And I'm coming to a close shortly. So the curricular expectations within the university already provide an opportunity to develop such holistic critique, as students are required to enroll in a variety of subjects and disciplines. So as opposed to art schools, and of course it has its own benefits and its own pool of skills and competencies, in the university context, both art and art history students are more exposed to a variety of disciplinary fields. So, however, instead of being exposed to different disciplines according to their own language and demands and traversing to a territory foreign to students, in order to confront the limits of their own knowledge and understanding, there is an increasing call that we are trying to combat to readapt the humanistic disciplines in the neoliberal arts context to professional needs. Ethics for engineers, art history for medical students, and sociology for business administrators. Finally, what complements critical pedagogy is cognitive mapping as a means to locate oneself phenomenologically and concretely in the increasingly abstract space of global capital, and more specifically of hyper-bureaucratized university. So I didn't think of the applicability of Jameson's concept to critical pedagogy until recently. A student who majors in both architecture and art history came up to me to share his draft for his final year project in architecture. So the student spent 6 years learning the professional tools and languages of his discipline without being encouraged to critically engage with the discipline itself or to question it. What does architecture do? historically, theoretically, and so on. However, he has been also taking art history and theory classes, as well as attending courses in philosophy, and participating in informal reading groups on modern alienation, on Hegel's phenomenology, and so on, where we discuss and read critical theory and materialist aesthetics. The student was proposing to map the university in terms of its structure, sites, and spaces where students perform their studenthood. These sites include the admissions office, the cafeteria, the smoking zones, the classroom, and so on. His idea after the initial attempt of mapping was to provide a live feed from these sites in designated pavilions where students could watch themselves and their peers in these ritualistic performances of studenthood. By mirroring daily actions of students that produce and reproduce this institution, the student was attempting to not only make sense of a structure which has exceeded his dimensions and human dimensions in general, but also to denaturalize the constitution of the institution by the subjects that unquestioningly reperform it. It is then that I understood that critical pedagogy and cognitive mapping are companions in an effort to de-reify understanding and experience in the conditions of late capitalist alienation, in this case, as it is captured structurally by the neoliberal academia. Ultimately, for Jameson, alienation is both the precondition for cognitive mapping and the condition that it attempts to overcome in producing concepts for something we cannot yet imagine. To cognitively map the capitalist social totality means to attempt to represent something that is unrepresentable, to locate the concrete phenomenological body in the abstract space that produces experience, and to insist on critical distance between the one who maps and what is being mapped in the conditions of obsessive immediacy and the promise of fast food knowledge and experience without mediation. As Jameson says, and I quote, "This is a challenge specifically in the age of global capital because of the increasing incongruity between labor and production processes and one's phenomenological experience. Essences and appearance, structure and lived experience, scientific truth, and individual experience." End of quote. So the student intellectually and intuitively made use of the tools provided by multiple disciplines: architectural drawing, philosophy, critical theory, art theory, artistic practices, especially inspired by situationism, in an attempt to map and understand his lived experience that has increasingly become not his. Then, and I finish here, it is from here that we can also start conceptualizing potential spaces for art and design education in the future, if there is ever one. I'll finish here, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Angela, for your wonderful talk. Of course, the neoliberalization of university education also plays an enormous role in Germany, and it's visible through the bachelor-master system, but also through in Baden-Württemberg, the region where our university is, through the new idea of, or the new institution of fees for foreign students to study here. So obviously there is this economization of knowledge, which here maybe is still less prominent than it is in the American universities in the post-Soviet area, but obviously also in the Near East, as Kamal Al-Jafri also told me that most universities in the Near East are really either like when they are older from the early colonial time, or really American universities that were founded there, right? Because this is something that obviously most of us, they don't even know. What I found also really interesting to learn is that there is a very strong relationship also in exchange between students from the Near East and Soviet university system. Is that right?
Exchange, do you mean an actual exchange or an exchange of kind of shared conditions?
To be only, I also thought that there are lots of students actually studying there. Is that right? Somebody told me.
Actually, I taught both at the American University in Cairo and at the American University in Beirut. You don't have many students from the former Soviet countries here. Actually, there was an opposite traffic in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when a lot of students from the Middle East, as part of, especially the Nasserist alliance with the Soviet Union, would go and study in Moscow, in Leningrad, in Kiev. But most of our student population, comes from are repatriates who moved to Lebanon after the end of the Civil War, but also students from different countries of the Middle East itself, especially the current and ongoing conflict in Syria. We have many, many students from Syria. And then, in terms of demographics, we have American and European students, and especially at the graduate level.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's just something that just to get a feel for how the system works. And because I found it really interesting how, on the one hand, obviously, you also receive it as a problem that how do you say that there is this demand from, I don't know, medicine students to do something with art history, etc., and that it is, of course, a dequalification of what art history can be. But on the other hand, in your example, it's exactly an architecture student who really also profits in his from this critical way of thinking within his architectonic practices. This is the ambivalence of the system that you are trying to describe, right?
Yes, it depends on how the humanities and arts are structurally positioned in relation to this vocational disciplines. Whether arts and humanities are subsumed, let's say, as tools to help them in their own disciplinary practice, like let's say again, like philosophy being subjected to the dictates of the instrumentalized logic for engineers, or whether philosophy is taken as a disciplinary construct that ultimately also makes them aware of their own discipline and its limits. It depends on whether the arts and humanities are subsumed, right, within this pragmatic instrumental logic of other disciplines, or whether they structurally pair with them and also shed a negative light upon the other disciplines. Not so much negative, but in terms of sort of denaturalizing the very constitution of these disciplines. And what happened to this architecture student, and we have actually many examples because their degree is increasingly towards sort of professionalization. There are very few art history and theory courses that they take, so they come to the art history program in search for some kind of deeper theoretical understanding of practice as such. Why do they do what they do, and how?
So this is something that you also think is really important to keep, that there are these disciplinary, you're not advocating interdisciplinary as such, but you're really saying, no, it's really important that there's a specific and deep understanding of what you're doing, and that doesn't mean that there is this interdisciplinary activity, or it's an expansion of the field.
Yeah, in a sense, the way we structure the curriculum is, you could say that there are lots of elements of interdisciplinarity. Sometimes when I teach my courses, like after the first month, students are like, is this an art history, a sociology, a political economy, or a philosophy course? But yet, there's a kind of a dynamic between a specific conceptual vocabulary grounded in the disciplines and its convergences across a multiplicity of disciplines that does not allow for a collapse of these disciplines onto one another. Right? That becomes this kind of like a flat terrain wherein even the object of critique can no longer be identified because it's like a pure convergence of, or a pure elimination or annihilation of any boundary that provides a kind of pushback. If you have pure interdisciplinarity, then what is the boundary that you're pushing against?
Okay.
Right? We need boundaries to
I totally agree.
critically engage with them.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Now, maybe there is space for one more question in the audience. It's a bit difficult because I have to sort of transport. Is there any question, urgent question that we can ask Angela? Ludmila, do you want to come? I know there's a microphone. Maybe it works. We'll see. Otherwise, I'll retranslate.
Thank you.
Hello, Angela. Thank you very much for your talk. It was really a brilliant presentation, and I have to say that I think it's really a fantastic idea to apply this framework of like post-Soviet condition to the situation in Near East. But I would go even further and say that we can actually apply this as a kind of conceptual framework to the whole situation all over the world. We have now within a global post-Soviet condition, in a sense, I understand, I will try to explain what I mean. This kind of ongoing neoliberalization, which actually is dealt on the fact that this collapse of this welfare state and this collapse of, let's say, very generous art, science and cultural policy, which really provokes this kind of ongoing financialization and neoliberalization of the whole higher education system. But what I wanted actually to ask, do you think is it, would it be also relevant to think in this, let's say, of course, like ironic, speculative mode to talk about like this global post-Sovietization of the, can you hear?
I didn't understand. Go again.
Pardon?
Mach das noch, sprich noch mal, ich habe selbst nicht verstanden.
Okay. So, wo muss ich anfangen? Yeah. Yeah, the question that this post-Sovietization of the like global situation in the art in the field of education in general, in the field of higher education, and aren't we in a situation where it's we can come back to the old concept of imperialism as it used to be described by like classical Marxist interpretation of imperialism, or going even to the concept of the cultural imperialism as it was provided by Bourdieu or Loïc Wacan, and this kind of cultural imperialism in terms of transferring this Anglo-Saxonian educational model all over the world. Is it kind of practice? It's not only colonization, it's a classical cultural imperialism as we know it from the beginning of the 20th century. So that's, would you agree with this like post-Sovietization on the global scale?
Anya, could you summarize, because
Yes.
the echo is really.
I think the question was really, I think, dealing with the question if there's your idea of the post-Soviet development that you describe as a model couldn't be described as a new form of imperialism that concerns the whole world, especially in the also in the cultural, also in a way of a cultural imperialism, like really in a classical sense of Marxist, or in the sense of cultural imperialism, like Bourdieu's way of understanding imperialism.
Actually, I would. Yes, I mean. In a way, I'm very sympathetic to Fred Jameson's periodization. I mean, because capitalism itself, right, is not a static phenomenon. Capital constantly morphs and it produces a different cultural logic according to the stages of its movement. So we need equally flexible and fluid tools in order to capture a fluid phenomenon. So coming back to this question of imperialism, I think it's a if we call it an imperialism, then we have to go back to the sort of early 20th century paradigm of monopolies, right? That Lenin called like imperialism as the last stage of capitalism. Of course, it wasn't the last stage, but perhaps like the new the new global order carries, of course, carries the cultural logic of imperialism, but yet it's an entirely different superstructure we could imagine, because it's not the old models of like very direct domination, but it's a domination via ultimate subsumption of all previously semi-autonomous geographical territories, but also spheres of knowledge experience under capitalist domination, under capitalist abstraction. So in a sense, like it's an intensified logic of imperialism, right? That we see today. So in a sense, yes, we can sort of revert to old analytical tools, but then yet we have to readapt these tools to the new situation. And there is nothing to mourn about the, the collapse of the welfare state. Because in a sense, if we look at the current structures and the current developments, if at all possible dialectically, then this global space provides us a vast number of possibilities for different kinds of mobilization, for different kinds of politics that is yet to be articulated. Okay. I don't know if this answers the question that...
No, I think it is a very good answer to the question already, and certainly an answer that also will lead us to our next lecture. Thank you very much, Angela, and have a good day.
Thank you for... Yeah, and I'm really sorry I couldn't be present.